So, hi, I'm Kieran. My presentation is based on exploring identity through performance, with kind of emphasis on disguise and anonymity in alternative music scenes. So, disguise has often kind of drawn a sense of intrigue from the audiences, despite living in a culture where authenticity can play such a vital role in the career of an artist. Many kind of choose to completely conceal their identity to their fans. What I'm aiming to explore through this presentation is why artists adopt such imagery, how does it kind of represent them to their fans, why they choose to pick that type of disguise. And with this in mind, I'd kind of like to examine to what extent anonymity plays in pop culture and modern kind of mainstream culture. So if we look at hidden identity in pop culture, you can kind of see a link between horror films and the more alternative music scenes. So so if you're examining the link between them, this is where you can kind of see how they can almost kind of correlate between the genre and scene. For instance, you have in horror films the symbolism of the masked killer, where the whole premise of the film is essentially to for the protagonist to try and figure out who the antagonist is. And that's where you can kind of see the parallel between almost the front man of a band and then the serial killer in a film, where just the audience is trying to figure out, who is this person, who am I watching? So with that in mind, continuing on looking at kind of alternative genres and image, with alternative music genres, there seems to be less boundaries, and therefore it can be seen as there's more room to express yourself creatively and in non-traditional ways. This kind of approach is discussed in Keith Kahn Harris's book, Extreme Metal, Music and Culture on the Edge, where he basically he defines the extreme metal music's scene and the transgression it goes through. And he does that by using these three pillars of analysing how they do it, which we'll come to later. But kind of stereotypically, the traditional imagery of performance and music can often be altered, with makeup, tattoos, piercings, body modification. And that's interesting there, the word altered, alternative, altering your persona. So what I'd like to look at is, and one of the main kind of artists I want to kind of base this research around is a band called Sleep Token, which is difficult in a way, but also not, in the sense that it's quite difficult to find primary research on these because they're such I don't really like the term underground band, but they're not massive in the mainstream, but they have a very, very strong fan base. So Sleep Token are a interesting band from the UK, and their sound is very kind of eclectic and diverse, a mixture of really catchy commercial pop mixed with more electronic and kind of avant-garde elements in the percussion, and then also finishing their compositions off with really heavy like metal guitars and screamed vocals. So it's a very kind of mixed bag. So then they link in with this kind of topic as their identity is also completely hidden, and no one knows who they are despite many theories. So the premise of the band's kind of image revolves around the concept of worship, cults, and kind of religious iconography and artifacts in a way. I mean, Sleep Token, they all wear black robes topped off with kind of white face paints and masks that all vary from each member. And they follow a very similar trend that I've noticed with a lot of bands that take this approach with their identity, where they have set names for their fan base and for their audience when you come to watch them perform, like Slipknot, Ghost, Gwar, Kiss. So Sleep Token have dedicated to the name either the disciples or the following, both are used, and that kind of puts a kind of foundation for the kind of religious kind of identity they're trying to kind of incorporate into their performance. But we'll explore this a bit later, the bond. So I think it's important to kind of try and not so much pinpoint, but try and understand why artists do it. So there's various reasons for why an artist would want to do this. The most kind of common answer people get when you ask an artist is they want their music to be the focus point of their performance. There's an article by Chris Richardson in the Washington Post where he's talking about anonymity in music in specific relation to a band called Subtract. And the lead vocalist said in this article that he essentially likes the fact he can walk around his gigs and no one knows who he is. However, I think that the argument could be made that their attempts for their performance and their recordings to be kind of the focus point, it could be kind of in vain, because if you go back to the parallel between the masked killer in horror films, where so much attention is kind of surged into finding out who they are, it can I feel like the audience could be some way distracted by kind of the such bold imagery and the iconic imagery. There's a quote from Ben Myers of The Guardian where he's talking about this topic in relation to black metal in Scandinavia, where he says black metal was an outlet through which they could express their muddled politics, which I think is very, very true, because much of the Scandinavian black metal scene is completely going against the norm, and partly with some of the reasons why they did such extreme things they did, such as the church burnings and the murders and etc. Artists could also kind of perceive to hide their identity in order to establish some sort of power play to the audience. There's another quote here from the Chris Richardson article where he says by artists kind of disguising themselves, they're essentially asking the audience to like them without clicking like, in kind of a metaphor for social media there. But there's another quote which says masks and disguises can amplify the dialogue between performer and audience by allowing both sides to divorce from reality, which I think is very interesting, because sonically, obviously, music itself is a very kind of strong kind of, you can break out of reality, you can be in your own world. But then also, if you have the visual aspect of get up, disguise, it kind of is playing on all the senses really. So it's just amplifying that kind of that relationship of this kind of self-help and breaking out of the real world problems, etc. Similar to even like 4D cinemas where they show films in 4D, where you have the temperature of the room gets colder and the smell gets different when something comes on screen. So interesting. But returning to kind of Harris's text and theories, we can examine these pillars I mentioned of transgression for an artist. So terms used quite frequently in Harris's text are these three pillars of transgression. So you have discursive transgression, which is the lyrical themes; bodily transgression, which is bodily modification, how you kind of express yourself; and then you have sonic transgression, which is the composition styles, etc. And Harris opens this chapter with metal has historically provoked strong reactions. And I think that immediately I thought, well, if the aim to provoke a strong actions from an audience is one of their sole purposes, then by dressing up, again, as I said earlier, you're kind of stimulating the other senses, not only the oral senses, but your visual senses as well. There's a very nice quote from Holly Crews here from an article where alternative music identities are constituted in scenes. So stuff like the culture as the demographics, location, age, gender, sexuality, all play a part in the scene of a genre and how the artist can represent themselves. This could kind of go back to explaining why in Scandinavian music it's such a common practice to wear crazy outlandish makeup, known as corpse paint, which could be seen as a reaction to governmental and stereotypical kind of constructs which they want to abolish and not resemble any part to. So the next part I'd like to kind of delve into is what does this disguise from an artist kind of create for the audience and the relationship? How does it create a bond? So the concept of disguise can kind of enhance the audience relationship and also participation, as we've mentioned with the naming of the maggots with Slipknot and Sleep Token with the Disciples. And it seems to be that there's this kind of inclusivity and bonds between them, because it's not just people going to watch another person on stage. The people on stage are a collective, and the audience is kind of, they are the actual fans. They have a name, and that kind of is recognised between both parties. So it's interesting, and it will be interesting to explore deeper that kind of sense of community and inclusivity and bond. So just to conclude, I think that there's a lot of research I can now delve into further, and topics for me to kind of explore in the essay. Just as now I've kind of explained the basic principles of how disguise and particular artists, how they're using it, and I can now kind of begin to venture into how this creates a platform for both audience and artist, and how we can kind of establish a more focused bond and relationship between them. Yeah, thank you.